Hello! I got back from a skiing trip last night and I really want to do my February reading wrap up early in March, so you're gonna get a cozy video today. I've done one of these before, I hope you like it. In February, I read 5 books and now I'm gonna talk about them. Book 1 was Unmasking Autism by Dr. Devon. This was a nonfiction read. I listened to it on audiobook and it was for a book club that I'm a part of. Now, I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was a great, for me, right, like I think like an introductory reading into understanding more about autistics, but obviously I think like supplemental reading is required. And I think it's weird to say that, like, right, like I always want to read more about a topic. I don't think you can ever be exactly fully well read on something like this, but what I specifically mean is that Unmasking Autism is primarily geared at people who are autistic and who need to, what I would say, kind of like need help unmasking, need help unlearning some of those social coping mechanisms, if that makes sense. Like, don't do X because X makes people uncomfortable, learn to do Y, you know, get over this, everything is hard just because it's hard for you, it doesn't matter, it's hard for everyone, like that kind of conditioning, social conditioning that we have. And so I think it was really nice to hear a lot of that conversation. What I really liked about Price's book was that there were a lot of different types of people with like autistic people who were talking. So, you know, you got it from different backgrounds. Devon himself, he is autistic and he's trans. He talked about his experiences. You just hear from so many different people, and I think that's really nice because I would understand if you're trying to relate to something, getting to see a bunch of different people means more people can relate, more people will have a voice that like kind of sticks out to them. So it's like, that's me, that I'm seeing myself in the pages of this book, which was really, really cool. In general, I think it's very, I learned a lot from it, and also it's not geared towards me. So that's really, it's nice to be able to get both of those things at the same time. I think too, like what this book really helped me do is change my mind about something. Now, my opinion previously, this is about self-diagnosis. I obviously like was always aware of how expensive and difficult certain types of diagnosis, many types of diagnoses can be. Being in the US, right? Like the cost prohibitiveness of it is one thing, but like everywhere, especially with something like autism, it is difficult to get a diagnosis, and then even more difficult to access the like appropriate levels of care that you need, and people who are going to be understanding to you. Now, where I was concerned about this, I think like the best example is sort of how you have these teens, I believe it was in Germany, right? These teens coming in and say like with symptoms of Tourette's, but then experts in Tourette's would be like, well, no, your symptoms don't actually line up. Like, it's not, based on what we can see, it's clearly not aligning with how Tourette's actually works. And they kind of sort of postulated it was a mass sociogenic illness caused by, you know, these kids viewing popular creators who did have Tourette's, and then they began, I'm not saying consciously, I think it was probably a very subconscious thing, emulating this. Now they did have that, right? Like they did have tics, so it's not fair to say they're faking it. Just because something is not like biologically caused does not mean that a person isn't experiencing some symptoms. But that was sort of like a concern that I had, right? Like if we make a lot of this information available, people might, you know, align themselves with a diagnosis and then continue to align themselves with a diagnosis, even if maybe that's not something that they themselves are experiencing. And also too, because sometimes like certain symptoms can be quite vague and can apply quite broadly. I don't know, like I've seen on TikTok, I don't go very frequently on TikTok, but when I do, like the stuff about ADHD, right? Like some of that stuff, like it really is so vague that like anyone can find themselves under that umbrella. And with the videos on TikTok I'm talking about, they're advertisements, which is like even more heinous, because it's telling people like, hey, you have X problem, well, try Adderall. Now, that being said, where I'm going with this is this book, I think, taught me to think about the sort of systemic disabling social factors, right? A lot of our elements of disease are, especially disability, I would say, are socially enabled. Like someone who's hearing impaired is in many ways disabled by a society that uses hearing to like the extent that our societies use hearing. If they lived in a world where everyone was like them, they wouldn't be disabled. A blind person is disabled by a world that like is assuming everyone can see. So that sort of conversation is rare, but also moving a step past that, where self-diagnosis can be helpful, is if you have this awareness, you can then become another community member, another person asking for the things that you need. And even if you're wrong, this is what Devon Price really taught me. Even if you're wrong, if you are making the world better for people who do have that, that's a good thing. And maybe you don't have autism, but you have similar experiences. For example, you might not have autism, but you might have like misophonia, or you might like get really overwhelmed by loud, busy, crowded spaces. And so you, in your community, you start asking for like quiet hours at a grocery store. So there's a period of time when autistics or other people who have these same sensitivities can go and shop. Like, yes, maybe it's not like coming from the fact that you have autism, but it is something that will benefit everyone, people with autism, without it. That's something else I started thinking about. Like, yes, like there are some concerns with self-diagnosis, obviously, because you should be able to get a proper diagnosis and live in a world that doesn't stigmatize you for that diagnosis. But at the same time, if we can work with the social pressures of that and then use self-diagnosis as a tool to like take down those disabling systems, good, like overall positive benefit. So yeah, that's how I felt about Unmasking Autism. Really good book. I highly recommend it. I think also too, like a good book club book. After that, I read A Wife for My Son by Ali Ghalem, which takes place in Algeria. It is an 18-year-old girl is sent to live with, or she's like marrying this man who works in Paris as like an immigrant worker. And the family is sort of a very big overtone of this book is the community expectations, both what women are expected to do, how these arranged marriages are expected to go, and then the family that she's marrying into, their expectation that her being a wife will force their son to stay. So when there are, sorry, my hair's bothering me, when there's difficulties in making that happen, the sense of disappointment in, well, we brought you here for a reason, and why isn't that like, why aren't you making him happy? And this is so well written, and I think it really develops and explores the different people in this particular situation, the mother-in-law, the sister-in-law, the main character, Fatiha, and her husband, her brother, like all these different characters I feel like in the family are quite well explored, even if they're not very like, I don't think the sister is like a very central character, but she's there and she's established well enough that you kind of know what she's thinking. You can know how, like, kind of know how she'll react to something, if that makes sense. I also love that this book does not, while there are people you don't like, there are not these one-minded, horrible villains. Like, I don't like how the mother-in-law acts, but at the same time, the book does a really good job of explaining, well, she had to undergo a arranged marriage, right? Like, she feels like she's done this is fine. Then she sees this girl who's supposed to make her like first son, her oldest son, stay, and that's not happening. Like you can understand where she's coming from so well, and you can even see too, like the husband, how he wants to relate, but he's having so much difficulty. He didn't really want this. Like, he's so, you can see too, like these characters' inability to communicate with each other. Like, their lives could have been easier, but because of just who they are and what they are, what their situations are, they'll just never be able to relate to one another. And I think it's so beautifully done. I also feel like Ali wrote a woman so well. I think Fatiha as a character, I have read books written by women this century who don't write women as well and as well rounded. I think the descriptions of the sexual assault that she experiences on her wedding night, that was described as assault. Like, that phrasing was used. It was not romanticized. It was not it was clearly not a pleasurable experience for her. It also deeply connects to female friendship. One of the big turning points involves female friendship. I didn't know where this book was going. I didn't know what to expect, but the characters felt so human and tactile and real, and they were very well written. If you're able to find this book, you should absolutely pick it up. Every time I stopped reading it and put it down, I was excited to continue. I didn't know where it was going, but I knew I was going to have a good time seeing what this author was going to do with the situation, and I thought the ending was also quite satisfying. Okie dokie. Ooh, after that, and that is one of the books I got in Providence, Rhode Island, and so is this. I got both of these at the Book Barn, which means of the 3 books I got at the Book Barn, I finished all of them, except there's a book about birds, which is a reference book that I'm not going to actually physically read. So this is Nip the Buds, Shoot the Kids by Kenzaburō. And this is another plague book that I've read. The plague and sickness has been a big feature in the books I've read recently. And this is during wartime in Japan. These sort of delinquent kids who are at a boarding school are evacuating up north, and they end up being sent into this mountain town where they're put to work. And shortly after they arrive, plague breaks out, and the villagers barricade them in the abandoned town where they are left to their own devices. So it's this discussion, it's like kind of Lord of the Flies, right? And so I think that this book is really clearly a social commentary, right, on how people are treated and how bad behaviors are created by these social circumstances and then punished by that. I don't know, it's a fascinating look on I think the psyche of these kids. We can see them, we can see how they're not evil and heartless, but then how they're treated, the reactions, the hostility that they face, it turns them into, delinquents and miscreants and all of that. And oh my God, this is such a well-written book. I am fascinated to look at this book versus A Personal Matter. I really like both of them, and they're both quite different in sort of who they're neither of them have really great protagonists. They're both not great people, but at the same time, it's wild to sort of compare the two. One of them an adult with responsibilities that he's shirking, and this one with these kids who are, they, no matter what they do, they will always be in the wrong. The one thing with this book that is, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of weird and a little out there, but the one thing that is very out there is there's this girl character. And throughout the book, she's almost described as a little girl. So in my head, I was imagining a 6-year-old, but it's never quite clearly defined how old she's actually supposed to be. Maybe I just read over that part too quickly, but you can imagine where that's gonna go. And so yeah, that part I don't love, because yeah, sometimes I'm thinking is this a 6-year-old? And then sometimes certain things are said and done, and I'm wait, is that a 6-year-old? How old is that? How old is that? I'm a little uncomfortable. But yeah, still really good. And I think this is teaching me that I should read more of Oi's work, because I really like it. It is Tokyo Chemist sort of described A Personal Matter as not very PC, and that is, I think, a good description of Kenzaburō. You're not reading someone with my political social sensibilities. Very clearly not this author, but still writing and commenting so well. Like, you can get something out of this even while being maybe like a little uncomfortable. After that, I read Brickmakers by Selva Almada. This was a very like surprisingly quick read. It is about it's about these two families, but also about the sons, like that. So it's the father and then the son on two ends of the families. And I think it talks a lot about generational trauma, the effects of growing up in like a closest to poverty, the effects of how like parental hardships trickle down. Yeah, like the plot of the story is these two kids are like adults. I think they're like probably 18 or something. They're dying. They're like, they were in a fight and they're dying, and the book is taking place as they're like lapsing in and out of consciousness. So it's like half them laying there dying and half them remembering stuff, or half us seeing stuff from like the past before they were born. And there's not like, I think it's one of those books, like I really enjoyed reading it, but there's not a lot to say outside of that. The back of the book makes you think that there's going to be like this big love component to it between the eldest son of one of the Brickmakers and the youngest son of the other one. That is there, but it is such a tiny sliver of being there. Like, I was expecting it to be much more, and it's like brought up in like that a little more than that, but it's not as like involved with the story as I feel like it could have been. But yeah, a story about father-son relationships, a story about poverty, a story about fused generational trauma, masculinity, all of the above. And it's really good and a very fast-paced read. And then the final book that I finished was The Diving Pool by Yoko Ogawa, and I have been looking for this book for freaking forever. I finally found it in Kinokuniya near Bryant Park. And it's a 3 short story collection, and it's sort of that classic like feel-good, weirdo, kind of creepy story where I just know I'm gonna have a good time reading it. It's the subject matter that I like. Off-kilter, nice, weird. So I had a good time reading this. I'm glad I found it. I'm glad it's in my collection. But there's not much more I think I can say about that. It is it does have that disquieting feel, that sense of loneliness that I think is really loved in like as Westerners. I feel like we definitely love that in like the Japanese fiction that gets popularized. I don't want to say what is actually like common in Japanese lit in Japan, because I'm not reading that, I'm reading this, right? So it's very good. I really enjoyed it. There's not much else I can say. Really, those last two, I feel like they were good, comfort, quick reads, not necessarily like A Wife for My Son, which I feel like was genuinely a stop and like the influencer gasp that we're all talking about, like that kind of book. That's what this is, and those last two were just like good books. In terms of what I'm currently reading, I am very slowly still chugging through We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. Yeah, I'm about 160 pages in, so I don't have that much left. It's just very hard. It's one of those slower books, right? It's gonna take a little bit of time. I've also picked up, I picked this up already in March, but They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us by Hanif Abdurraqib. This is my book club pick for March, so I'm very excited to read this. I do love that, like, I feel like a book club is a great way to pick up some of those readings on your shelf that you're, I want to read this, but I'm not necessarily picking it up right away I know I'll be able to get through this because I don't want to be rude to my fellow book club comrades. But yeah, so that's what I've been reading so far. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if you've picked up any of these books, and if you did, what you thought of them. Anyway, thank you, and I'll see you in my next video.